Hello everyone. We're going to start the final session for today. My name is Cam Hocking. I'm the Digital Education Programs Coordinator for Museum Victoria. It's my great pleasure to introduce our final keynote for the day. The person who is going to tell us about a very exciting project is Melinda Cashen, and Melinda is a teacher at Princes Hill Primary School. I was lucky enough to work with Mel in a previous life for a little while, and it was fantastic to work with her there. And then I was also lucky enough to be involved in this project relating to the Princes Hill Primary School Museum, and Mel's going to talk about the collaboration and how the Princes Hill Primary School Museum worked. But it is also my great pleasure to announce that this project has won a Museums Australia National Award. So last Wednesday at the conference in New Zealand, this project won the interpretation, I better get the exact one. It is Interpretation, Learning and Audience Engagement. And it won the National Award, which I believe is Princes Hill's first Museums Australia Award. It's not our first one, but it's Princes Hill's first one. I'll just read you the judges' comments. This was a nice collaboration between a large institution and a local school, allowing students to view Melbourne Museum through the eyes of a curator because they were all curators. Nicely conceptualised, a key foundation was the strength of the relationship and mutual trust between the museum's education staff and the key teacher at the school, who is Mel, but Mel also makes the point that all of the other teachers in that teaching group were equally involved. This is a great example of collaboration in improving the quality and value of museum visits. So I wanted to say congratulations to Melinda, to the teaching staff, the staff at the school, but most importantly to the grade 3 and 4 students who put together such an amazing project that they have won a national award. And I'm going to hand over, and I'm very excited to hear from Mel, who is going to be presenting today. And please feel free to tweet away while we're going on Primary 16. So Mel, come on up.
Thank you. That was quite an opening. When you start with the award, we were meant to finish with that, Cam. But a lot of really good points that Cam's just made about this project is that I might be the person standing up talking about it this afternoon, but it really is the kids who have done this. I'm lucky enough to work at Princes Hill Primary School, where we're quite passionate about the kids directing their own learning, and that the way that we make sure that the context around them is really important. I'm just going to start my timer because I know what'll happen, and being the last session, that's a bit of a worry. So Princes Hill Primary School is just down the road. We're just off Lygon Street, so not far from here. We are an inner city school, so we're classed as being capped due to our close location to the city, and we have 450 students. Across the school, we believe in some principles about learning, which really do sort of underpin everything that we do at Princes Hill Primary School. So we believe that children are active, important members of a variety of communities. We believe that children learn through critical engagement in complex, purposeful contexts where relevant connections are made to their world. That we learn through active expression, forms of expressions. We develop motives to learn through positioning ourselves within the social situation. And we learn through the unity of emotion and intellect. So all of our inquiries really embed those principles of learning throughout our school. And this was another example of that. So I'll just give you a bit of a background first to the project, but what I really want to do this afternoon is tell you the story. So I've got loads and loads of photos and loads of anecdotes and some quotes from children and some videos that will really show the essence of the project and the possibilities of an inquiry. If I can get it to work. Okay, we're getting there. So at the beginning of we actually started with the teacher research. Teacher research is really important at our school because we believe that we are learners as much as the children are learners. So the first thing that we recognised when we got together with a new group of students was this understanding from children, and you see this through the curriculums that we were talking about this morning, how children in Prep 2 tend to be really individual focused, looking at themselves, their identity, where they fit into the world. Whereas when we get to Year 5, 6, we take on a much more global approach to learning and to the things, the actions that we're taking. And we wondered, what does that mean for students in Year 3 and 4? What does that mean about bridging the gap? What is it that helps us to understand or go from an understanding of identity to a global understanding? And that was really important for the beginning of this project and this inquiry. So one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to find out what was important to the children. So we asked them to bring in a seed. You can see in this photo here, this is our seed wall. And it was an opportunity for us to see what was important. What's important to the kids in our neighbourhoods and in our learning environments. And the things that they brought in were not probably a shock to us. We didn't learn anything new from what they brought in. There was a lot of things that were important to them, things that brought back memories of experiences that they had, things that they cherished at home, really individual identity-driven objects that they brought in. So we started to wonder about how can we move this, how can we shift this to a more global or a more community-based approach? And the museum became a perfect opportunity for us to do this. So as Cam said before, I wasn't new to the museum and I knew that Cam worked here, but I was able to catch up with him at one stage and we started talking about what a museum means now. What is it for? What's it like when children come and visit? And so we started a conversation about how we might be able to get the children here and get them thinking about museums and how they're made, how they're curated, what it's like to be a curator. So we saw this as a really great opportunity for the children to explore the understanding of curation and how a community shares its knowledge using the museum to do that. One of the first things that we did after we made the connection with the museum was actually to bring the staff up to have a look. We used it as an opportunity for us to do some learning. So we came out one afternoon and we spent some time wandering around the museum, thinking about what it meant to us, what would it mean to the children, what were the pieces or those important artefacts that were inside the museum. And then we had our planning meeting here. So an opportunity to really think about what it meant to us as learners before we took it back to the children as learners. And then we went back to school with the idea of a provocation for the children. What is it that you know about museums? So the first provocation that we sent for them was for us to find out what they knew about museums. So it was as simple as, build us a museum. Any form of expression that you would like, show us your idea of a museum. So we had lots of different things that came out. We had a group of children who used big large sheets in our performance area and stacked them over chairs and created a museum that you had to line up outside, you had to get a ticket, you had to wander through, there was opening and closing times, and it all played out as a part of a role play underneath the sheets in the corner of the room. We had other children who created them online using Minecraft to show this is my museum and this is what it looks like. There's some examples here of some museums that children made using just models. You can see things hanging from ceilings here and the different areas and the different exhibit parts. But we wanted to go further. We kept digging and digging. This provocation nearly took us the first term. So one of the things I probably should have mentioned is our inquiries don't have a start and finish date. They generally carry over a whole year, and sometimes they even go further into the next year. So we really wanted to understand, what is it that the kids know about museums? Is it just that they go and visit, or do they understand the idea of a curator? What I'm going to show you now is just a short video, and I'm sorry, the audio is terrible. You know what it's like when you're recording in a classroom. about where the kids were after they made their first museum.
Well, this is our museum, and there's painting, and it's
An Aboriginal museum.
and also a bit of Chinese.
Why those two?
Well, because we saw Aborigines are connected to they were the first people here, and then we want to respect that,
And we want to represent them.
we want to represent them,
And then Daniel just made these sculptures and we decided they look a bit Chinese.
so we'll add one Chinese painting.
And that's
And inside
That's
we've got the tiger of the Chinese painting,
And
then
we got
other
an
side
Aboriginal.
another Aboriginal painting.
So you can see there some of their understandings about museums. They're using some of the language that you might expect if they had visited a museum before. It represents the first peoples, probably children who have visited the exhibits here before. They knew it was important and that the museum exhibits had been chosen on things that the community felt were important. Important for us to respect that. But then you could also see the things that we noticed were missing. The connections. It was an Aboriginal or First Peoples museum with a Chinese section because, well, we made a sculpture that we put on top that looked a bit Chinese, so we thought we'd put it in. So really starting for us to see that some of those connections were missing for the children. They could see the superficial ideas that they see when they come to visit a museum, but we really wanted to go a lot deeper. We wanted a lot more understanding. We wanted to know how we identify and curate important cultural knowledge. So the next step was to set up a set of further provocations for the children to really start to unpack what it is that happens in a museum. So these were two provocations that we looked at. The map here on the left, this was really interesting to see the connections the children started to make. The idea was that they looked up a museum somewhere across Victoria. It might be somewhere that they've been before, something that they've heard of, somewhere that there's researched on the internet. And they just needed to label it with a pin, what the museum was and where it was. Well, as the map started to fill up, the discussion started to come out for the kids. Oh, look at this. All of these museums that are in Bendigo are all about gold or the gold rush. Oh, look, all of the museums that are along the sea are all about like sea animals or seashells. Oh, look, the ones that are in the big city have bigger themes to them. So they're more open, like the Melbourne Museum that has lots of different things in it. Whereas when you go into smaller local communities, they're more specific. So it's farming equipment in the gold rush. So they were starting to ask questions, starting to identify that there's actually a bit more to this museum stuff than just starting a museum. And that's when we really started to thinking about the idea, well, what would it look like if Princess Hill started its own museum? What would happen if we were to make our own museum? What would it look like on that map? Other provocations that we looked at, what's in a museum? So we used Google Cultural Institute as a way to visit virtually museums all around the world where we could look at the types of artefacts that were in them. We looked at the opening hours of museums. So we had kids getting information from what time all of the museums were open across Victoria. Noticing trends like the fact that in rural Victoria they tended to be open less days of the week. Starting to think, why do they have museums that you have to go and visit? Why can't we just do it online and then anyone can visit at any time of the day? These were some of the questions that were starting to come from the students. And we also looked a lot at how they were designed. How was it important for the visitors that came to the museum? And then we started to build a partnership because we knew that we couldn't answer all of these questions and we couldn't build a museum on our own. So as we said, the conversations already started with the museum and we'd started to build that partnership, but the children hadn't. So we had Cam come and visit for the first time, where he came and talked to the kids about what it is that he does, what he knows about the museum, why the museum is such a wonderful place. And this was just the beginning, because what was important about it was the conversations that followed. As Cam wandered around the provocations and the learning that the children had done, and they started explaining to him, this is what I've made and this is why I've done this, and have a look at this. And this was probably the first point where I realised that this idea of building a partnership was not just for our school, that the museum were able to take a lot of learning, a lot of thinking back on as well. And I know that Cam was certainly overwhelmed the first time he visited to listen to some of the knowledge and the understanding and the content level that some of the children had. This is a little exhibit that a couple of girls got together and created. One of them really loved this surfer. So they decided to build a museum about waves and water and surfing, and they put a lot of connections in there. But you can see some of their understanding already, that museums are full of factual information, that there are displays, artefacts on show there. They also made a whole heap of interactives to go with it. They're understanding that if you're going to teach somebody something, that they need to have avenues by which they can understand it. So this is a little bottle that you squeeze and the diver goes up and down. Or on the side there you can see the wave bottles, from where they turn it upside down and it creates a wave. We couldn't always get Cam to come to the school, and we obviously couldn't always come down. But the connections that we made through online was great. So this was just a quick tour that Cam did through the museum. He was able to just take his phone and walk through the museum, and we could have a quick look just to keep us thinking about the things that we wanted to be learning about and the things that we could learn from this partnership. And then, of course, came the time that we needed to come to the museum to have a look. One of the things that had started to happen back at school was that there were groups of interest that were starting to be formed around the types of things that children wanted to exhibit at our museum. We're starting to think about what is it in our local community that makes our school important? What might we want to share with the community at our museum? So children were already starting to think about things that they enjoyed or things that they thought the public might like to see. And it was great because they were starting to form quite fluid groups around different exhibits that might exist at our museum. So we gave the children a choice of which museums they wanted to go and visit. We did several trips where we came to the Melbourne Museum, Science Works and the Immigration Museum. And depending on the style of museums that the kids wanted to visit or wanted to make, was the museum that they went to. Now, this was actually another chance for us to really think about the visit to a museum. I'm sure we've all done the visit before. When we turn up, you get the treasure hunt piece of paper and you run through and you find all the things that you need to do, and at the end of the day, teachers go home exhausted and the children go home with a whole heap of knowledge that's been dumped into their heads. I'm not saying that's what this museum's like, but these are some of the experiences I'd had with a museum trip before. So we decided, what if we look at it a little bit differently? What if we go with a different mindset? So we split it into two. The first half of the day, we went in as visitors. And this was a time which was very tough for me to actually stand back and let them go. There was no me telling them, quick, we've got to move on to the next bit. We need to be here at this time. We need to be doing this. I actually just let them go. At times, even when they were a little bit loud, I held myself back and thought, no, they're not disrespecting anybody else in here at the moment. It's okay. It's not my control. This is their visit to the museum. And it was really interesting. I think this photo itself tells a lot. the kids that are running through, going, look, 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 look. But then you also have other children that are just sitting there taking it in. The way that they looked at the museum was really interesting. The second half of the day was actually them going in as a researcher. I'm going to show you first just a quick video that was taken. So this was from Kit, who wore a GoPro as he visited the museum, as a way that we would be able to reflect on what it's like for a visitor of his age. He's also composed the music, so I do apologise, or that might wake you up this afternoon. So it's obviously been sped up, he's not that quick. But you can get a bit of an understanding of what it's like for a child. The things that interest him, the things he goes straight past. I don't think he's reading any of the information on the walls. But he is stopping and looking at all of the interactive things and anything that moves. You can see he's also having a couple of conversations with people, so you can see when he stops to have a chat. And it was actually really nice when I stood back and watched the kids, how many interactions they had with other visitors. Because I'd stopped and let them go, that they were actually there helping other visitors and sharing their things that they were learning as they were going along. So much of what I saw in that first half of the museum visit was like this. They just moved very quickly, sort of flitting between different artefacts and moving on. Not questioning, not asking, seeking to understand the things that we'd hoped that they would get out of a museum trip. But the second half of our trip was completely different. So this is when they went in as a researcher. They each had an idea or something that they wanted to look at. And I found that they stayed sometimes for an hour at the same exhibit, the same artefact, trying to understand it as much as they possibly could. So these two boys were looking at the age and how they organised the dinosaurs. Was there a pattern to the way that they were organised in the dinosaur walk that would help them to think about how they might organise their artefacts at school? Some of them drew the organisation of each of the artefacts or the displays. What information was in there? How many pictures were there as opposed to writing? What sort of language did they use? Elias here on the left, your left, he's actually counting up the senses used as you visit the museum. So he wanted to know how many times did you visit an artefact that required you to use hearing or required you to touch something, or was it just sight? He found later on that there was nothing in the museum that allowed you to taste, and he thought that that was something he wanted to add to his museum. So that second part of the visit was a complete turnaround to the first. It's the deep learning that I really wanted to see when I came to the museum. Luckily enough, we'd built up a partnership where we could make that happen. This was a visit to the Immigration Museum. And if you take a look at this picture, it actually appears later on in the actual museum that the children built. So I think it's a really key key aspect to the learning that they did on these trips. Now, I'm going to cross over to a little bit of a side note here because I thought it was important to sort of share as well. It was really a big indication to us about how we ran excursions. One of the things that we considered as a team was we got our principles of learning that we have everything to do with the things that we do as a day-to-day at school. As soon as we go out of the school, we just drop back into this, like that idea that children are empty vessels and we need to fill their minds with knowledge. So we really wanted to unpack what the school camp would look like for them. So we did some provocations around Beechworth and what it was like in Beechworth, knowing that we were going to be visiting there for our school camp. And it was interesting to have a look. Here's this great excursion that we were doing to Beechworth. They were going to learn so much about history and experience so much. And all they cared about was the social part of it. They wanted to know what the rules were going to be. Was I going to get sent home if I broke the rules? Who am I going to sleep with? Do I really have to do the dishes? These were the things that were really interesting for the kids. So we decided we needed to put more social time in their school camp, but we also decided we needed to make it connect to them. So we gave lots of opportunities for them to experience parts of Beechworth before we arrived. And one of the things that we did on the bus on the way over was to give each of them an identity. Now, the idea actually came from this museum when the Titanic exhibition was on. And we remembered walking in, you get a little card that gave you an identity. You're either first class or second class, or you had this identity. And at the end, you actually turned up to the wall and you looked up to find out if you were dead or alive, pretty much. And we thought it was a great way to actually move through the museum, to have that identity, to take that on. So every child got on the bus with a new identity. So for some of them, they were, I think this is Sir Isaac Isaacs, who we've got up here at the moment, real Beechworth identities, people that they could connect with when they were there. We had Ned Kelly was an obvious one that was there. We had people who were building owners, newsagents, Chinese miners, so that everything that the children experienced while they were on camp could actually come back to their identity. We had kids finding their name on streets or on signs. Street signs. Oh my gosh, look, that's me. Can you take the photo with me and my sign? And this was a funny moment where the museum that we visited were lovely. They went through and they explained some of the artefacts. They looked at it, it was really great. And then they gave this look and find sheet for the kids to go off and find. Well, they didn't care about that at all. All they wanted to do was to find themselves in the museum. Look, this door is me. So giving them a real identity, something to focus on. When they were mining, they were actually talking about that experience as if they were the miners. And then when we came back, they continued to research. I need to know more about my person. Why was it that they died at this age? So this is a great opportunity for that further learning. As I said, that was just a little side note, but I think it was really important in the learning that we did as teachers through this inquiry. Now back to our museums. We've just been off to the different museums. We've come back with all of this knowledge. We decided to split our museum building, the museum we were going to make at Princess Hill, into 3 areas, because this was what we'd learnt from our trips. So there was content, there was design, and there was experience. So we went really heavy to start with in content. What am I going to put in the museum? What's important to this community for me to put in this museum? And I'll just share a couple of the projects that came out. As I said, there were lots of different groups. So this is the local housing group. They've been busy spending time online, looking at old houses and being able to establish a bit of a timeline of the types of houses they might find in their local neighbourhood. So you can see down the bottom they've got labels and then the years, and they've got some pictures for their design. So of course they popped out to the local neighbourhood to have a look. What is out there? What can I see? So they started to use observation skills collect photos and put them on the timeline, and really think about the different parts of these houses that gave clues to the times that they were built. Thinking of their museum, they actually created the information to share with others. So some of the picket fences that they noticed in the street, they were able to write facts about them. The types of brickwork, facts about that. The wrought iron fences or trimmings around houses. And then they decided they needed to focus in. So they had all of this knowledge and they decided, now the audience is really important to me. How am I going to think about the audience in this? So they decided to do it just for the street across the school. Now in the experience part of this, what they ended up doing was using augmented reality, where they put little videos explaining the types of houses within this large panorama, and when you hold your iPad over it, it'll pop up with that video of them speaking. I can show you a photo of that a little bit later. But their understanding of the houses out the front of the school was quite exceptional because they hadn't looked at housing right everywhere. They decided to focus in and were able to really see with the detail the housing in that area. This is another group that looked at Princes Park as our local environment. The first thing they did was actually just went down and let the camera go for an hour and took a time lapse of the park so they could use that to look at how it was used. What are the important parts of how it's used? And this led them to write a survey. They realised that lots of people use it in different ways, and this park must have its own stories, and the people within the park must have their own story about what they used. So they created a survey for park stories and went and surveyed people using the park. They then created big posters of these and were able to share it a bit like a Humans of Princes Park in a way. But the skills for them to be able to write up the survey, thinking about the things that people might want to know about the park. What's their park story? Interesting, they talk about the things that you might not like about the park, and they'd already addressed some of them, like too much dog poo was one of the things. So they were able to pick up on some of those parts to the park. I'm just going to share, this is Mia who's talking through at the moment her museum, and we're still not quite there yet. As teachers and our research, we're thinking there's still a little bit missing about the connections between the audience and the community and our museums. All right, I'll just leave the video running, but I'll just explain to you. So Mia's talking about the different elements to her project there. These are little quizzes because she's seen these at a museum before. And she talks about the fact that there's a question and then a hint and then the answer. She looks at the different uses of the park. So she's looking at people who use it for sitting, for dog walking, and they've also surveyed the community about the different ways that they use the park. And she moves on to these are the stories. So that idea that all the parks have its own story. What happened right at the end, when talking to Mia, it actually connected with me what it was that was still missing from these conversations. And what had happened in the last week of school, she'd actually been off to visit another park in a country town somewhere in Victoria. And she came back all very excited because she'd made the connection while she was away that Princes Park is not unlike any other park, that every park has its stories, and that it's actually the influence of the people who visit those parks that make those stories. So to be able to move from this idea of this is something that was in my local community, and I chose this because it was just down the road and I know that a museum has to take in part of its local community. That was her reasoning for choosing it. To be able to actually have that understanding that the parks that you visit are made up of the people within it, and it's the way that they use it and they perceive it that makes the parks the way they are. It really is quite a deep level of understanding of that. The writing next to it, this was quite a little funny one that she discovered in the early days when they were investigating that there were different boundaries to Princes Hill depending on where you looked. So if you Googled it, it was different to what Yarra Councils had said was the boundary. So she actually wrote out a letter to the council explaining why, what she needed to know. Now the letter never actually got sent because she was able to come to her own conclusion that Google just had it wrong because Yarra Council are the people who set the actual boundaries, so they must be right. So she didn't need to send it off. But just that process of thinking about it, being able to question what she was doing. This is another group that looked at the history of Lygon Street, and there was some really nice sort of things to come out of this. There were two groups that joined together a little bit for a bit of the time, and I was actually just trying to find, I had a little quote here from, here we are, from this group, and this was the question that they were investigating to help do their museum was, what would Carlton be like without Italians? And then they've got statements here like, lonely people, question marks. Italians are very nice. No happy houses. So apparently Italians make happy houses. Still very young was one of their answers. And probably most importantly, no yummy food. So this is this group working with a market researcher. So we happen to have one of our mums who's a market researcher. So she came and helped develop some questions for the kids to go off and ask that would help them in building their museums. So they're coming up with some questions, and then they went for a walk down Lygon Street, and they just waltzed straight in and asked the questions that they needed to. So they went into readings, asked some questions there. One of the gelato shops, which I can't remember which one now, where they did also get some gelato to go away, but being able to ask some of the questions. Why do you think this business is still here? What makes this an important business in Lygon Street? What is it that makes Lygon Street Lygon Street? So some of the questions that they were able to ask. They also went into Doc Pizza, so that was another area. But these weren't the only connections going out and finding out. We also used our social connections, our online social connections. So Twitter was a really great one for being able to connect with the museum and other museums. We used the Ask a Curator Day to ask some questions about experience and how people experience the museum. And also some of the different webinars that the museum puts on. So this was Dr. Walker, I think, Ken Walker, who was explaining about how bugs are kept in the museum and insects. And then we also had some face-to-face connections that came out of the work that the children were doing. So we had Pete from the museum, who was a designer, that came and spoke to us about how to design an exhibit. We've got one of the children had a connection with Harry Navilla from Melbourne City, and so they asked him to come out and talk to them about football or about soccer and about their exhibit and how they would be able to add to it. We had Bob from Oculus Architects, who had actually designed museums before, came out and talked to us about the design process of an actual museum. And that was where a lot of our maths came from. So we did a lot around scale, measurement, design, shapes, etc. And then we used Code the Future to find an app designer who came out and talked to us about some of the games that we were making as part of the experience. So this was some of the designs. So the students were able to build their own museum designs, look at the scale, how big should my museum be? And then prototype them. Whoop. And prototyping them. And then came the time for us to get really close to the idea of building our own museum. We had the content. We'd started to think about the experience. So we were starting to think about the way it would look for people coming in. How would we get them in? What would they do when they were in our museum? And we went back to the stuff that we'd learnt when we visited the museums about how did the museum get our attention. Digital answers was a really big thing. So these were some of the digital solutions, building apps. So this was a grocery store app that went with the plants exhibit. And it looked at the vegetable patch that was part of our school, and they made sure that the vegetables found in the grocery store app that the kids could play were also found in our school veggie patch. There was another one that was part of the bug exhibition. So you are the ant, collect the food and avoid the other bugs. And then came probably the most exciting part of our trip. When you build a partnership with a museum that lasts over the whole year, one of the great things that you get to do is ask for lots of things, and sometimes you get given them. The kids wanted a pop-up. They wanted to go and test their ideas out. They wanted to hear from experts. So we asked Cam, can we come to the museum and bring our exhibits and open it up so that people can come through and give us feedback? And Cam said yes. So we were able to bring on the tram all of our exhibits in boxes, walk them into the museum and set up a pop-up museum where we invited staff from the Melbourne Museum and Museum Victoria to come along and to give us feedback on our exhibits. So we busily set up in the hour we had to prepare, bringing everything out, making it look like it did back at school. And then it was open for feedback. I probably don't need to say too much about these photos because I think the photos themselves tell the story. So this is the children and their exhibits and people giving feedback. Museum staff giving feedback and parents giving feedback. Now I think I'm right in saying this is the CEO of Museums Victoria here kicking the football. The kids were oblivious. I thought it was amazing. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's the CEO. The kids didn't care. He was just somebody who was going to kick the football with the kids. And you can see here some of the feedback sheets asking about those areas of design, experience and content. And my favourite photo. And then based on feedback, they went back and changed some things and did some more things. So the Italians of Lygon Street said, oh, it'd be really great if you could taste the food. So they made food. We had pizza and lemonade and different things. And then came the time for us to start our own museum, to actually open it up to the public. We'd timed this for the end of the school year, so we'd cleared everything out. Everything went home and we had a bare slate. And then we had to decide where the museum would go. So we had to work in groups. We made some categories, organised, yep, this will be all of these exhibits here, this is the order. Then we had groups work together about space. How much space do you need? We need this, can we do this? The collaboration that was happening at this point was quite amazing. And you can see in the middle of this picture, there's a tree with an opportunity for people to put tags on it. So it's that inspiration coming through from the initial museum visit that they had. Talking together about where the museum's going to go, what it's going to look like, how they'll exhibit. And then it was museum opening day. To go with the museum, one of the things that we created was a museum booklet, an exhibit book that went with the museum. And I've got some copies up here if you'd like to have a look at the end. But each of the groups had to explain what was happening in their exhibit. And we were very lucky to have a graphic designer parent who put all of this together for us, but with all of the children's writing. And they've now got, and we're able to sell at the door exhibit booklets as they came through. And then it was open and people came. We had a group that would sit out the front and count how many visitors we had so they could collect data on it. We had tour guides ready to show you around as you came in if you requested it. And it flowed and worked just like a real museum. With opportunities to interact with some of the things or to read about things and the experiences. even an outdoor section like the museum here, where you could go out and use these QR codes on trees to find out more about the different trees in the school. And we even had some of the staff from Museum Victoria come by to see the finished product. So that feeling for the children to know that they'd really connected with a community partnership, that they would come back. And I know, Liz, you were back a couple of times to see us, and just being able to share in that learning. And these were just some of the exhibits that we finished with. So I'm going to finish there. I think for me, the joy of this project were over a number of areas. One was the ongoing nature of the partnership. It wasn't just let's connect and then that's it. Museum Victoria came with us along that whole journey and still continue to today. I've got a card up in my bag for Cam to give later because one of the students has made it. So that ongoing relationship, I've had parents coming up to me in the playground in the last few weeks going, when do we find out about the award? But also the depth of learning that the children were able to get by really continuing on and building that partnership, that we kept going and we really, where I guess sometimes it's easy to go, oh, that's just the too hard basket, that development that continued the whole way through was really important. So yeah, I think that's probably the end of that story. I do know that there's time for some questions, but really it is about the kids and what they were able to produce at the end of this, and that's who the award goes to, and that's definitely who the credit of this goes to. So thank you.
Are there any questions?
So we're only a week for the museum at school, and we just had a couple of hours each day where it was open and people would come through. So we just continued in the last week of school doing our normal learning. Yeah. Any other questions?
Mel,
Yes.
I want to know. Actually, this is a question that one of the judges asked me at museum, was how did the teachers sustain this and see it through to the end? Because I think that's the big question. What was your role in all of that?
Yeah, I think the big part for that is that our principles of learning really underpin that. So everything we do about it comes through those principles of learning. But the most important bit was that we were learners too. If we'd given up halfway through, we would have lost our opportunity to learn. So it really is a fact that we saw ourselves as researchers and learners, and that we were learning. I must admit, it's completely ruined my take on museums now. I went to America over the holidays and visited a couple of museums, and all I was critical about them now because I've got this new sense of knowledge about museums. So I think it was really the fact that we were the learners as well. Okay. I'll leave these books up here if anyone does want to have a look before they head out. Thank you.